Enzo Ferrari. This is the definitive account of how Enzo Ferrari became the master of motor racing and one of the most complex, important and imposing figures in the 20th century. It is the definitive biography. It is by Luca Dal Monte, and I'd like to say that Luca joins me live on the line now. Luca, good morning to you.
Well, good morning to you. Good morning, everybody.
Good to have you with us. Ferrari, the most evocative name in motor racing. Everybody wants to race for the prancing horse. What does Ferrari mean to you as an Italian, Luca?
Well, it means the world. I mean, keep in mind that I grew up in the 70s, and Enzo Ferrari was very much alive then. And my brother and I were big Formula One fans, and in Italy in the 70s, I mean, to be sure, you would appreciate, all the British teams, Ken Tyrrell and Colin Chapman and James Hunt and all those wonderful drivers. But, Ferrari was like the home team. And Enzo was such a big personality. I mean, I remember the first, local televisions. There was one set in Bologna, which was the city where Autosprint, the weekly magazine, was being done, and the same people that ran Autosprint had this kind of television channel or whatever, just on Friday night, and they were the very first talk show on Formula One in Italy. And I remember in the second half of the 70s, Enzo would call in live and argue with those people. I mean, he knew them; they were his friends. His friends in the press. Marcello Sabatini was a larger-than-life journalist, just like Enzo was a larger-than-life manufacturer. And they would argue, but hastily. They would just yell at each other. And then at the end, everybody would be a friend. But it made an impression to you as you were growing up, yeah.
And of course, Monza, the Tifosi, the motor racing fans like none other.
Well, I remember, we would go, our father would take us to Monza in September. And, again, go back, there was so little about Formula One all year around. And then, again, Autosprint would have, a special issue on Tuesday. And then, normally we would go, Saturday and then sometimes Saturday and Sunday, but the day before we left, in the night, you just wouldn't sleep with anticipation. And you would leave early and then, stand in line for a long time. There was no hospitality in those days, and certainly not for us. But it was incredible. I mean, it was definitely one of the most expected days of the year.
Absolutely. Isn't it strange in the 70s, whereas you think of Ferrari, you think of passion, you think of the romance, and yet in the 70s, it's not really only the Swiss who brings glory to Ferrari. It's louder. It's the clinical Austrian, the man who thinks, whilst James Hunt is the passionate English playboy, and you would think that a passionate playboy would be absolutely superb for Ferrari. But if you look at it's Lauda who wins the championship. It's Scheckter rather than Villeneuve who wins the championship in '79. It's these, it's these cooler drivers in the '70s who win. More clinical drivers who win rather than the romantic figures.
Correct, but keep in mind that James came very, very close to come to Ferrari for 1974.
Yeah,
when finally Enzo Ferrari settled for Niki. Especially so because Claire Regazzoni was lobbying for him. But along with Niki, he was considering Jean-Pierre Jarier, the Frenchman, and James Hunt. And they actually, I don't think Enzo met with James. He met with Lord Escott.
Yeah.
And he was kind of confused. So in the end, he just went along with Montezemolo, who was a very young team manager, was strongly pushing for Niki, and Claire Regazzoni was pushing to have him again with them. They had been together at BRM that year, and so that's the way Niki went. But I mean, there's a big point there. Go back to the 70s. Okay, 1970s is 30 years after World War II.
Yeah,
for Italy to root for an Austrian, it's I want to say it's almost nothing short of a miracle. The war with all that left here. And so many people were still alive who had been in the war. did not make for Austrians to be so loved. And yet Nicky, with this class, with his charm, because he was charming, in a different way from James Hunt, of course. But everybody was in love with Nicky. And even though it was like hard, his Italian was very funny. So he normally spoke like a mixture of Italian and English and some German words. But people coming of age in those years, like myself, if you ask me, who's my favorite driver, I would tell you, well, Jackie Stewart and Niki Lauda. Jackie Stewart, because my father, I remember the very first Grand Prix that I watched on TV was the British Grand Prix 1973, and he did such a great move at the first start, and then he repeated it again at the second start. And I remember my dad, showing my brother and I, that's how you drive in Formula One. And then Nicky, of course, with that beautiful 312T with the white periscope and the Italian flag. It's I still get excited today thinking about those. It's been 50 years.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because you talk about an Austrian, but in 1960, Ferrari had Wolfgang von Trips driving for them, the great German driver who died at Monza in a Ferrari, and he was accepted. I mean, he was another great talent, along with Phil Hill, who was the 1961 world champion.
61, correct. Yes. Well, von Trips, it's a bit different, though, in a way, because by the 70s, Formula One was almost like a mass market product in Italy. Von Trips, to be sure, motor racing has always been followed in Italy very, very much. But, the 60s is a little bit more detached. So, von Trips was like a nobleman. This is wonderful, person. But, the phenomenon, the publicity stunt was Nicky. Yeah. And Nicky was Austrian. And again, nothing against Austria personally, of course. But in Italy, Austria and Germany, they, especially then, they did not really settle well.
Let's go back to that. Let's go, because you and I can probably talk about this, and everybody else is going, what are these two people talking about? So let's go back to the man himself, Ferrari, because it is the subject of it's just been the subject of a film. Interesting. Yeah. I saw it. Interesting film, I think we can say. Not enough cars for my liking, but hey. And I went with my father, who said the cars would have been much dirtier halfway through the Media Miglia. They were much too clean. And also there's an Apple TV series coming out based on the book you've written. We know, when we talk about and think about Enzo, the old man, we think about him with those sunglasses, in the suit, sitting at home, calling in because he very rarely went to races, so he would call in for the report. So, but his background is as an engineer, and he was a racing driver to begin with.
Yeah, he did start as a racing driver in 1919, and he was not even that bad, to be honest. He doesn't really, when he writes about himself in his wonderful 1962 autobiography, he basically kind of say, yeah, okay, I was okay, nothing major. But then if you go back the way I did, researching for the book, and you go and read, the news from those days and what journalists and his fellow drivers thought of him, you realize that, well, yeah, he may not have been Jim Clark, the Jim Clark of the days, but he was not bad at all. He would win some of the races. The problem is, I think that he was very, very rational. He's always been a very rational man. And at one point, I think he realized that no matter how hard he worked or how fast he pushed, he would never be like the Jim Clark of his days, like Campari and Antonio Ascari. So at that point, I think that a conflict arose in his mind, I'm putting my life on the line every time I go out with my racing car, but I will never really be like them. And so at that point, there's this big thing in 1924 European Grand Prix in Lyon. He goes, and then he's actually afraid and goes back home. And that's like the end of his real motor racing career.
And so he goes home, he thinks, okay, that's it. And then he thinks, I know, I'll start making cars. Is he working for other people? Because the first Ferrari, now I'm probably going to get this wrong, Luca. Is it 49, the first Ferraris, or is
47.
it 47? 47, okay.
Yeah. But what happens is it goes in stages. Okay, actually, by 1927 he returns to racing, even though like he doesn't really race the big races anymore. He's still good, but he is not like racing let's say he's not like if it was today, he's not racing Formula One anymore. He's racing like lower formula.
Okay.
He still wins actually. But by then, his mind is pretty much set. He has like 5 dealerships, Alfa Romeo dealerships. Like he's more of a commercial man. And then what he really comes up with is in late 1929, he decides to like open a racing team. That's how Scuderia Ferrari, the racing team, is born. And they race between 1930 and 1937. Then they are purchased basically by Alfa Romeo. So for 2 years, it's kind of like a hybrid. It's not Scuderia Ferrari anymore. He's the team manager of Alfa Corsa. He hates it actually. And then he manages to be fired and goes back to Modena with a lot of money. But throughout the 1930s, he's like the soul and the brains of this like racing team like no others.
And during the 30s, it's an interesting period for motor racing. And I'm going to be careful what language I use here, Luca, because places like Germany, for example, which have the Autobahn and everything is looking forward. And the fascist movement in Italy is all about looking forward and modernity. And nothing embraces modernity more than motor racing. Now, in Germany, you have Auto Union, and you have Mercedes, of course, who are winning everything with some Germans, some Italian drivers. And the same in Italy, although not as perhaps the backing isn't as the backing of the Italian Alfa Romeos isn't the same as the backing of the Auto Unions and the Mercedes. So how does Ferrari deal with Mussolini and what's happening with Italy in the 30s?
Well, it's a very complicated relationship because, as you said, the German government, after 1933, really gives a lot of money. Not as much as people has made out, but still there is like a lot of contributions in gold marks. So they support the racing program. In Italy, at one point when the Germans start winning, this is very Italian, by the way, the Italian government pretends that Alfa Romeo and Scuderia Ferrari obtain the same results, but they don't give them the money that the Germans are giving them. And actually, at one point, there is a big controversy because the Italian state, the fascist government, would like Scuderia Ferrari to be englobed into Alfa Romeo, just like like a state-run team, just like the Germans. And so Enzo fights to keep his independence, and he's actually good in doing it for like 2 years. 36 and especially 37, but by 1938 he loses out. So he sells for a lot of money his Scuderia Ferrari to Alfa Romeo, and then he becomes part of Alfa Romeo. But as I said before, and again, this is very Italian. We would like to do like the Germans, except that we don't give you the money that their government is giving you. But then again, go out and get them and try to beat them.
So what happens with Ferrari during the Second World War? Because obviously Italy suffers terribly. I mean, Italy is devastated during the war.
Well, what happens is by 1939, Enzo is fired by Alfa Romeo, so he goes back to Modena. And then again, for the third time in 3 years, he gets a lot of money. But he signs this agreement according to which there's a clause. According to this clause, he could not name any car Ferrari for the next 4 years. So he goes back to Modena. So this is like September of 39. By October, he already has a new company, which he calls Auto Avio Costruzioni, meaning like he's going to construct cars and airplanes. He never will do airplanes, but he will build some engines for airplanes or some parts for the airplanes, just like Alfa Romeo used to do. But by November, so 2 months after being fired, he's already working on a new car. He cannot use he cannot use any parts from Alfa Romeo, so he actually buys spare parts from Fiat, and he wants to make that, and he wants to make 10 cars. The first two are ready in the spring of 1940, and he sells them to two people, one of which is Alberto Ascari, the future Formula One world champion, 52, 53. And these guys, with this car that does not have a badge, it also only have a name, which is a number 815. They go and take part in the 1940 Mille Miglia. So theoretically, that's not a Ferrari. That's an Auto Avio Costruzione 815. He's supposed to. The cars don't do too bad, even though they're way too young. So neither of them ends the race. But in Enzo's plan, he wants to do 10 of them. So he really wants to start production. Then, of course, the phony war ends and World War II really starts in the spring of 1940. So that's the end of everything until 1945, basically, when the war ends. Maranello, in the meantime, he moves out of Modena because of the bombing. And then in 1947, he has his, the 125 is his first like car that he can put the Ferrari badge on it.
And it's in Maranello. A lot of people just think motorsport maybe is Formula Uno, but sports car. You mentioned one name, which was Mille Miglia, and also the Targa Florio, and these huge road races, which would be ridiculous to run now. But the sports cars that come out, and on the front cover of this book, you're looking at one of the most beautiful cars. It's a picture of Enzo in his without his sunglasses, but there's also with the 250 on the front, which is the GTO, which is like a beautiful car, and Ferrari sports car racing really does help sell cars and is extremely glamorous. But also you're thinking of Lancia, there's other Alfa Romeo, Lancia, Maserati, and you come in the Michael Mann film. There's Udo Maserati there, very brief appearance. They are, at this time, the long distance sports cars races really are on a level easily with Formula One, because the drivers are racing one weekend on a Grand Prix and one weekend in the sports cars.
Yeah, that's very safe to say. That's correct. And but the long distance, motor racing actually starts with long distance races. Like the concept of a racetrack, does not really come on board until the 1930s, I would say. So the Mille Miglia, who's actually the first run of the Mille Miglia was 1927, but, they go on through, before the war and after the war. And you mentioned the Targa Florio. The Targa Florio, I think the last run was 72 or 73.
73.
Yeah, which is like kind of crazy if you think of what happened at the Mille Miglia in 57 with, 9 people dead and the 2 drivers. But that was a lot of the racing. And if you were a car manufacturer, you could prove much more on a long distance race like the Mille Miglia or the 24-hour Le Mans than you could actually do with a Grand Prix, even though Grand Prix were much longer than they are today.
When does Ferrari capture then? Why does Ferrari continues in a way that Maserati doesn't, and the Lancia doesn't, and even Alfa Romeo doesn't? And Ferrari has been constant in Formula Uno, and to a certain extent, sports car racing until, say, the late 60s, early 70s, with works teams, because I think the works teams pull out in 1971, 72 as well. But how does Ferrari keep going? Is it because they get the backing of Agnelli? And again, one of the things that annoyed me in the film was the fact you get this very short cameo of Agnelli on the phone, and you think, oh, if only they'd kept going with Agnelli in the film as well.
Yeah, even though the film does not get it right in terms of years, because Gianni Agnelli does not get into the picture until the late 60s, not the late 50s.
Right.
No, I think the answer very easily is because Ferrari had Enzo Ferrari. What I'm saying is, he was, he was a man moved by this desire of racing, winning, of course, but racing. So we know that he did not really care that much about production cars. I mean, he was interested in production cars as long as he could sell them and have the money to race. And this is actually pretty unique. Normally it's the other way around. Today people race to advertise their company and their products. Ferrari's always been the other way around. They sell cars in order to be able to race again. There was a great line, which is not factually true, but gives you the idea of the first years, 40s and 50s. Like Enzo would say, I'm selling on Monday the cars that won on Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not technically true, but that's the idea.
And if you think about the way he sold cars in North America, for example, because that was, because of the racing pedigree.
Well, at one point, Luigi Chinetti, very early on, he says, Europe is devastated, send the cars over here. And Enzo, Enzo's always been very skeptical of anything that was new. Like, he had been burned very early on with his first entrepreneur adventure that basically failed in 2 years. So ever since 1922, whatever he does is very, very skeptical, and he thinks twice or three times before he actually does something. But at one point, he realizes that Luigi Chinetti is right. Send those cars to America. You sell them because America hasn't been touched by the war, and so that's what he does. Coming to Fiat, Fiat is an interesting thing because by the mid 60s, if you are as small as Ferrari, it's becoming more and more difficult to race. Not so much in Formula One, but like in sports car. You need 50 or 100 cars to homologate in order to race, and if you do not have the backing of a big car company, it's difficult to come up with the money to do this. And so that's, which is the same reason why at one point Maserati goes with Citroën, the French. Enzo is lucky enough to find not so much Fiat, but Gianni Agnelli, because, keep in mind that when in 1969 they strike a deal, most of Gianni Agnelli's advisors at Fiat were against the deal because they thought it was not profitable. Imagine what would be Fiat today without Ferrari.
Yeah, exactly. How was Ferrari's relationship with his drivers? Because I'm going to go back to 57 again, because for me it's a year, because we have the huge crash that's covered in the film, which is Portago de Portago, the Spanish nobleman. At the beginning of that film, you've got Castellotti's fatal accident as well. Musso dies in the same year as well, and also Peter Collins, the British.
58. Yeah, Musso
58.
And Collins, August 58.
58. Okay, and that 12-month period then, a brutal period. Yeah. And the rumour is that Ferrari isn't at the test track when Castellotti is killed in real life. I don't think he is. And he gets a phone call and he goes, Paul Castellotti, and then he goes and Commodore, how is the machine? How is it? So did he care more about his cars than his drivers?
That's not true. It's part of the legend. Which kind of, interestingly enough, like a lot of these legends, he doesn't really care to deny, if you think about it. But what people should never forget is Enzo was a driver. He knew exactly what the chances, the risks that these people were taking. So there is no, I know he's famous for being harsh on the drivers, for not caring about them. That's not true. I mean, he'd been a driver himself. Then, of course, whenever one of the reasons why he liked, for instance, Niki Lauda or like all the non-Italians was that whenever, Niki won, it was like a Ferrari win. If Bandini won or Scarfiotti won, that was the Italian drivers winning. So he could grow jealous of his drivers if the press was giving too much space to them rather than the cars. There is a great story that this incredible, he passed away now, but Nestore Morosini was the one of the Formula One journalists from Corriere della Sera, and the Corriere della Sera is Italy's largest paper. And, everybody was expecting, Gilles Villeneuve, because he'd been so lousy at his first races. And then he goes to Long Beach, 1978. Like, it's the first time that he does really well in qualifying. And so Nestor Morosini writes this great story that, finally says, Enzo Ferrari was right. This guy is a good driver. I don't know what he did like in qualifying. Anyway, long story short, and that's California. So that's 9 hours behind Italy. And Nestor used to tell the story, like at one point he gets awakened in the middle of the night. It's Enzo calling him from Italy, and he's upset. Why? Because he wrote a great story on Nestor wrote a great story on Gilles, but he forgot to mention that Gilles was racing on a Ferrari. He never used the word Ferrari in the story. Everybody knew that Gilles was riding a Ferrari, but the journalist did not mention it. And Enzo was totally upset. So what did he race with? Did he run or something? Enzo could be jealous of his cars, but to say that he did not care for his driver. Again, it is part of the legend.
It's part of the legend. Because when Villeneuve dies in 82, isn't it? He says that he will see Gilles' face among his family and his friends looking back.
Yeah, I mean, it's you also have to keep in mind that when Gilles dies, he's 84, so it's not senile, of course, but he's an old man, and he lets his emotions out. But for instance, and that's in the book, I talked to people who were watching the qualifying with him that day, and when they called him and says, look, he's not going to survive. He ran to the bathroom, just basically to cry out. And then when he came out, he had tears in his eyes.
Mm.
This is like firsthand account of Carlo Benzi, one of his friends, and he was watching the qualifying with him. So, he did care.
And when Ferrari dies, of course, there's, you couldn't write it, but there's a Ferrari 1-2 in the very next race, which is Imola. Am I correct?
It's Monza. Yeah, it's Monza.
Monza, sorry. Yeah.
Ayrton Senna was leading, and I think Schlesser, I think he just like
the famous chicane. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot has been made of this, but it's like, it's just a coincidence, of course. I don't believe in.
So, what are you hoping that people will take from this? Is it to look at the real man behind the icon? Because we have this, I always think of him with the dark glasses, in the perfect suit, with 16 mistresses behind him, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, even like the dark glasses. First of all, he does not wear dark glasses until like the early 60s. And then again, despite whatever he says, I put my glasses on because I don't want people to look like into my soul, something like this. The truth is, he had very light blue eyes. And at one point in his life, light was damaging his eyes. So that's why he needed to keep sometimes his glasses on. But there are so many instances where he wore like his normal reading glasses that were not dark. What I would like for people to get out of the book is the sense that reality is always better than the legend. This man had vices and faults and flaws like any of us, but he was big because he never let go. He had, he had a passion, he had a dream. When he realized he would not be the greatest drivers of his generation, he decided to do something else. And he gave birth to the Scuderia concept. There were racing teams before him, of course, and some of them were actually called Scuderia, which is Italian for stables, horse stables. But the way he did it, he redefined the whole thing. And then when he finally started his own company, think about again, 1947, Italy is devastated, okay? The war, the Civil War, the Germans, burning everything after we betrayed when we did a separate peace with the Allies. So, that's when the real war started in northern Italy. And Mother is in northern Italy. And this man comes up with a car that has a 12-cylinder engine. Who are you going to sell it to? There's nobody in Italy.
I've only got 20 seconds before we go live to Germany. So the book is called Enzo Ferrari, The Definitive Biography of an Icon. It's by Luca Dal Monte. If people want to find you online, Luca, where can they find you, please?
What do you mean?
The website.
The website is lucadalmonte.net.
Look, we're going to run out of time. It's been an absolute pleasure. The book is called Enzo Ferrari.